100 of the finest engineers at Aurora Dynamics stood around the prototype, each shaking his head in quiet defeat. The investor demonstration was less than 24 hours away, and the engine refused to wake. Evelyn Cross stood at the center of the garage, her eyes cold as steel, asking the same question to every engineer in the room: was there anyone who could save this car? Nobody answered. Behind the glass partition, a man in a maintenance uniform stood watching in silence, a mop bucket in his hand, and not one person in that building knew who he was. Who was the quiet man behind the glass, and why could 100 engineers not solve what he already understood? The night shift at Aurora Dynamics always began the same way for Gabriel Hayes, with the soft hum of fluorescent lights and the long, empty hallways that smelled faintly of solvent and cold metal. He pushed his cart past rows of darkened offices, past glass walls etched with the company logo, past motivational posters he had stopped reading months ago. The building at this hour belonged to nobody but the cleaning staff and the occasional engineer chasing a deadline, and Gabriel preferred it that way, moving through the silence like a man who had made peace with being invisible. He emptied trash bins with the same careful attention he gave to everything else in his life, methodical, unhurried, and entirely without complaint, the kind of steadiness that made supervisors trust him without ever quite noticing him. At 9 in the evening, like every night, he stepped into the stairwell, pulled out his phone, and called his daughter before she went to sleep. Grace was 8 years old, and her voice always sounded smaller over the phone than it did in person, as though distance shrank everything that mattered most. He asked her about her day, about the drawing she had made of a horse with too many legs, about whether her grandmother had remembered to braid her hair the way she liked it before bed. Grace told him, with the seriousness only an 8-year-old could summon, that her teacher had said horses only needed 4 legs, and that she planned to draw a 5-legged horse again tomorrow, simply to see what her teacher would say. Gabriel laughed quietly into the phone, the sound echoing slightly in the empty stairwell, and told her that some of the best engineers he had ever known had spent their whole careers being told their ideas had 1 leg too many. When the call ended, he stood alone in the stairwell a moment longer than necessary, the way a man does when he is setting something heavy back down before picking up something else entirely. He thought, as he often did at this hour, of how strange it was that the people around him saw a uniform and a cart and assumed that was the whole of him, when in truth it was only the smallest, quietest fraction of a much longer story. He did not resent the assumption. If anything, he had built his life around encouraging it, choosing silence the way another man might choose armor, because silence asked nothing of him and offered, in return, exactly the kind of predictable, protected life he needed in order to raise his daughter alone. There were nights when the silence felt almost like a second job in itself, requiring its own quiet discipline, its own small daily decisions to say less than he knew and ask for less than he deserved. Nobody at Aurora Dynamics knew much about Gabriel beyond his name and his schedule. He arrived at 7 each evening, wore a gray uniform with his name stitched above the pocket, and left before the engineers arrived in the morning, a pattern so consistent that the building's rhythms seemed to bend around him without anyone quite registering why. He was polite, unremarkable, and careful never to draw attention to himself, which made him easy to overlook in a building full of people who had spent their entire careers learning how to be noticed. What none of them saw was the way his eyes moved when he passed the engineering floor, lingering for half a second too long on schematics taped to whiteboards, on diagnostic printouts left carelessly on desks, on the open hood of a vehicle parked overnight for testing. It was a habit from another life, one he had buried so completely that even he sometimes forgot it had ever existed at all. 8 years earlier, Gabriel Hayes had been someone else entirely. He had led a propulsion systems division at one of the country's most respected aerospace firms, the kind of engineer whose name appeared quietly on patents instead of headlines, trusted by people who themselves were rarely trusted by anyone. He had married a woman named Hannah, a structural engineer with a laugh that filled rooms and an instinct for solving problems that everyone else had already declared impossible, and together they had built a life that felt, for a while, entirely untouchable. They used to sit at the kitchen table at midnight sketching designs on napkins, finishing each other's sentences the way only 2 engineers in love could, certain that whatever the future held, they would meet it together. When Hannah died suddenly after a short illness, Gabriel found himself standing in a nursery holding a 6-month-old daughter in one arm and a resignation letter in the other, unable to imagine handing either one to someone else. The company offered him a leave of absence, then a reduced schedule, Then finally, quietly, the suggestion that perhaps it was time to consider his options elsewhere, phrased the way companies phrase things when they have already made their decision. Gabriel did not fight it. He left the only career he had ever wanted in order to become the only parent Grace had left, and in the years that followed he discovered that nobody asks an unemployed grieving father about his patents, only about his availability for the next shift. He chose maintenance work deliberately, not as a fallback but as a strategy, because the hours allowed him to be present for every school drop-off, every fever, every small catastrophe that defines the early years of raising a child alone. He had applied to Aurora Dynamics specifically because the night shift began after Grace's bedtime and ended before she woke, a schedule built around her needs rather than his ambitions. He never once told anyone at the company that the man who emptied their trash bins at midnight had once designed engines that flew faster than sound, partly out of pride and partly out of a quiet fear that the past, once spoken aloud, might somehow demand to be lived again. There had been one afternoon, almost 2 years into the job, when Grace had come home from school with a science assignment asking every student to interview someone whose work they admired, and she had announced, without a trace of doubt, that she intended to interview her father about machines. Gabriel had spent that entire evening at the kitchen table answering her questions in the simplest possible terms, describing how an engine breathes and how a battery remembers, careful never to let his explanations drift into territory that might reveal how deeply he actually understood the subject. Grace had written her report in careful, looping handwriting, declaring proudly that her father knew everything there was to know about cars because he worked around them every single night, and Gabriel had read the final page twice before folding it gently and placing it in the drawer where he kept the few things in the apartment that mattered most to him. He thought of that evening often during his shifts, usually while wiping down a workstation or restocking a supply closet, and the memory always arrived with the same quiet ache, equal parts pride and grief. Grace believed her father understood cars because he cleaned around them, and there was a kind of mercy in that belief, a simplicity that protected her from a history far heavier than anything an 8-year-old needed to carry. Gabriel had decided long ago that some inheritances were not gifts, and that the weight of his old career, with all its triumphs and its losses, was one he intended to carry alone for as long as he possibly could. The Helix prototype had been Aurora Dynamics' answer to every skeptic who said the company moved too slowly compared to its larger, better-funded competitors. It was meant to be unveiled the following afternoon to a room full of investors and a federal transportation official, whose support could secure funding for the next 3 years of research and development. The vehicle combined an experimental battery architecture with an autonomous control system that had taken 2 years and tens of millions of dollars to develop, and everyone in the building understood that tomorrow's demonstration was not simply important, it was existential for a company that had already promised more than it had yet delivered. Evelyn had personally walked the board through every milestone leading up to this moment, staking her own credibility on a machine she believed in completely. She had founded Aurora Dynamics 9 years earlier out of a small rented warehouse with 4 employees and a single half-finished prototype that barely ran for 10 minutes before overheating, and she had spent every year since convincing investors, regulators, and her own board that patience would eventually be rewarded. 2 larger competitors had already launched similar vehicles to lukewarm reception, and privately, several board members had begun to ask whether Aurora Dynamics had simply moved too carefully in a market that no longer rewarded caution. Evelyn had pushed back against those doubts in every meeting, insisting that the Helix prototype represented years of disciplined engineering rather than a rushed imitation of someone else's idea, and tomorrow's demonstration had been designed specifically to prove her right. At 11 o'clock that night, while most of the engineering staff had finally gone home to sleep before the big day, the prototype's engine display flickered once, dimmed, and went completely dark without warning. The first engineer to notice was a junior technician running overnight diagnostics, a young woman barely 2 years out of school who stared at the dead screen for nearly a full minute before she trusted herself to believe what she was seeing. Within 20 minutes, the call had gone out to nearly every senior engineer in the company, phones buzzing awake across the city with the kind of urgency that needed no further explanation. By midnight, the garage that housed the Helix prototype looked less like a workspace and more like a hospital waiting room, full of tense faces, half-finished coffee, and the particular silence that settles over a room when nobody wants to be the first to say how bad things might really be. Jackson Reed, the lead engineer on the propulsion team, arrived first and took charge immediately, pulling up diagnostic logs across 3 separate monitors while issuing instructions to anyone within earshot. He had built his entire career on being the smartest person in any room he entered, the engineer who solved in hours what other teams took weeks to untangle, and he intended to solve this the same way he solved everything, through sheer force of intellect and very little sleep. He ran the standard battery diagnostics first, certain the answer would present itself quickly the way it always had before, and when it did not, he moved methodically through every protocol he had ever trusted, refusing to consider that the problem might lie somewhere outside the boundaries of his own expertise. Evelyn Cross arrived at the garage just after midnight, her blazer still buttoned despite the hour, her phone buzzing with messages from board members who had already heard, through channels she could not entirely trace, that something was wrong. She had built Aurora Dynamics from a small research lab into one of the most closely watched companies in the industry, and she had done it by refusing to accept the word impossible from anyone who worked for her, a discipline she had once considered the truest measure of leadership. Tonight, however, the word impossible kept circling the room like something nobody wanted to say out loud, hovering just beneath the surface of every failed test and every exhausted glance exchanged between engineers who had run out of new ideas hours earlier. She watched her team work in shifts through the long hours of the night, watched coffee cups multiply across every available surface, and watched the clock on the far wall move closer to the hour none of them wanted to face. She did not raise her voice, did not demand explanations she knew nobody could yet provide, and instead simply stayed, present in the room as proof that whatever happened, she would not be the kind of leader who disappeared when things went wrong. By 2 in the morning, she had personally reviewed every theory presented to her, asking sharp, precise questions that revealed just how much engineering knowledge she had absorbed over the years, despite never holding the title herself. By 3 in the morning, nearly 100 engineers had cycled through the garage in one capacity or another, each one bringing a theory, a diagnostic tool, or a desperate suggestion pulled from years of training and experience. They tested the battery management system 3 separate times, certain the fault had to live somewhere within its architecture. They rewrote sections of the control software, rebooted every subsystem in sequence, and replaced 2 components that showed no obvious signs of failure but seemed like reasonable suspects given the limited time remaining. Nothing worked. The engine remained silent, the diagnostic screen blinking the same unhelpful error code it had displayed since 11 o'clock, refusing to offer even the smallest clue about where the true failure might be hiding. One senior engineer suggested, half seriously, that the entire control unit might simply need to be replaced wholesale before morning, an option Jackson rejected immediately since no spare unit existed, and building one from scratch would take far longer than the hours remaining before the demonstration. Another engineer wondered aloud whether the failure might be tied to a software update pushed 2 days earlier, and the team spent nearly an hour rolling back versions and rerunning tests, only to watch the engine remain exactly as dark and silent as before. Each failed theory seemed to drain a little more confidence from the room, until even the engineers who had arrived at midnight certain they would solve the problem within the hour found themselves running out of words to reassure each other. By 4 in the morning, even Jackson Reed had run out of theories worth testing, a fact he found almost impossible to accept after a career built entirely on never running out of theories. He sat slumped against a workbench, staring at lines of code he had already reviewed 4 times, aware that the silence in the room had shifted from focused determination into something closer to dread. Around him, engineers who had once been confident, even arrogant, about their abilities now sat with the particular stillness of people forced to confront the limits of their own training. Nobody wanted to be the one to say the demonstration might need to be postponed, knowing exactly what that would mean for the company's reputation and for the careers of everyone standing in that garage. It was Evelyn who finally said what everyone else had been avoiding. She stood once more in the center of the garage, surrounded by exhausted engineers who could no longer meet her eyes, and asked, for what felt like the 100th time, whether anyone in the room had a solution they had not yet tried. The silence that followed was the kind that arrives only when 100 trained professionals have genuinely run out of answers, a silence heavier than any words could have been. Jackson Reed finally spoke, his voice flat with exhaustion, admitting that the team had exhausted every diagnostic protocol they knew and could not identify the source of the failure before the demonstration began in less than 14 hours. Evelyn nodded once, dismissed the room, and asked that anyone with new information call her directly, no matter the hour, before walking out alone to make the phone call to the board that she had been dreading all night. Gabriel had been pushing his cart along the perimeter of the garage for the better part of an hour, careful to stay out of the way of the crowd of engineers who never seemed to notice him regardless of where he stood. He had heard fragments of the conversation throughout the night, enough to understand the shape of the problem, and something in the description of the failure had caught his attention the way a familiar voice catches attention in a crowded room. As the engineers filed out, exhausted and defeated, Gabriel found himself standing near the open hood of the Helix prototype, looking at a diagnostic readout left glowing on a nearby monitor, recognizing a pattern he had seen before in a different vehicle, in a different decade, under a different name entirely. He approached Jackson Reed carefully, choosing his words the way a man chooses his footing on unfamiliar ice, and offered quietly to take a look at the engine himself before everyone gave up entirely. Jackson turned to him with the particular tiredness of a man who had just lost a battle he was certain he would win. And the look on his face shifted quickly from confusion to something close to amusement once he understood who was speaking. He asked Gabriel, not unkindly but not gently either, what exactly a man who mopped floors thought he might find that 100 trained engineers had already missed across 6 exhausting hours. A few of the remaining staff laughed quietly, not out of cruelty exactly, but out of the particular exhaustion that makes small cruels feel almost harmless. Gabriel said nothing further in response, simply nodded once, picked up his cart, and continued down the hallway as though the conversation had never happened at all. Evelyn had been close enough to hear the exchange, though she had not looked up from her phone during the entire conversation. She remembered vaguely, registering the sound of laughter and a man's quiet, unprotesting apology, but her mind was already 3 steps ahead, drafting the message to the board that would need to explain why tomorrow's demonstration might not happen at all. She did not consider, even for a moment, that the man pushing the cart might be worth a second look, not because she was unkind, but because exhaustion narrows a person's attention down to only the problems they already understand how to name. It was a small failure of attention, the kind people make 100 times a day without consequence, except that tonight it would matter more than she could possibly have guessed. Gabriel finished his rounds an hour later than usual, his mind circling back again and again to the diagnostic readout he had glimpsed on the monitor before Jackson dismissed him. He recognized the signature of the failure, a particular kind of kexinal interference that masqueraded as a hardware fault but was, in his experience, almost always something else entirely hiding just beneath the surface. It was the kind of problem that hid in plain sight precisely because it did not behave the way engineers expected failures to behave. And it was the kind of problem that 100 brilliant minds could miss for exactly that reason, trained as they were to look for large failures rather than small lies. He thought, walking toward the parking lot, of something Hannah used to say, that the hardest problems were never the ones that looked complicated, they were the ones that looked too simple to be the answer anyone wanted. When his shift technically ended at 5 in the morning, Gabriel did not go home. He found Walter, the night security supervisor, who had worked the same hours as Gabriel for nearly 3 years and trusted him the way people trust anyone who has never once given them a reason not to. Gabriel asked casually whether he might have a few extra minutes in the garage to finish wiping down the floors near the testing bay before the morning shift arrived and the building filled with people again. Walter, who had seen Gabriel work countless overnight cleaning jobs without complaint, waved him through without a second thought, never imagining that the request had nothing whatsoever to do with floors. Alone in the garage, surrounded by the wreckage of a night that had defeated 100 engineers, Gabriel set down his cleaning supplies and opened the hood of the Helix prototype for the first time since the failure began. His hands moved with a certainty that surprised even him after 8 years away from this kind of work, tracing wiring harnesses and connector housings, the way another man might trace the route of a familiar drive home without needing to think about each turn. He pulled a small flashlight and a multimeter from his jacket pocket, tools he had quietly kept in his car for years without ever quite admitting why, and began testing the thermal control module that fed signal data to the engine's primary processor. It took him less than 20 minutes to find what 100 engineers had spent 6 hours missing entirely. A single component within the thermal control module, A small relay responsible for regulating signal timing under extreme heat had been installed during a routine supplier upgrade 3 months earlier and had never once been flagged as a point of failure because on paper, it had nothing to do with the engine's primary systems at all. Under the specific thermal conditions created by the testing bay's overnight cooling cycle, the relay introduced a microsecond delay into the signal feed, just long enough to convince the engine's processor that a catastrophic fault had occurred, triggering an automatic and total shutdown as a built-in safety measure. It was not a broken engine at all and had never been one. It was a perfectly healthy engine being lied to by a single overlooked part that nobody had thought to question. Gabriel worked quietly and methodically, replacing the faulty relay with a spare from the maintenance supply closet that happened to meet the same exact specifications, a small irony he allowed himself to appreciate for exactly one quiet moment. He tested the connection twice, recorded the change in a simple paper log he found near the workstation, describing the failure mechanism in the precise technical language he had not used in nearly a decade. He started the engine just long enough to confirm the display had returned to a steady, healthy state before shutting it down again, unwilling to leave the vehicle running unattended. He left no note explaining what he had done or why, no message announcing his discovery, nothing that might draw the kind of attention he had spent 8 careful years avoiding. He simply closed the hood, gathered his cleaning supplies, and walked out of the garage as the first gray light of morning touched the parking lot outside. When Jackson Reed arrived at 6:30 that morning, already dreading the conversation he would soon have to have with Evelyn, he found the Helix prototype's diagnostic display glowing a steady, healthy green for the first time since the previous evening. His first reaction was disbelief, followed quickly by a kind of suspicion that made him pull up the building's overnight security footage before he allowed himself to feel any relief at all. The footage showed exactly one person entering the garage after the engineering team had finally left for a few hours of rest, and it was not another engineer, a supplier representative, or anyone with the technical clearance the situation seemed to demand. It was the maintenance worker in the gray uniform, the same man he had laughed at 6 hours earlier without a second thought. Evelyn arrived within minutes of Jackson's call, her exhaustion replaced by a sharp, focused alertness that made her seem taller than she actually was as she crossed the garage floor. She watched the security footage twice without speaking, then asked for the paper log Jackson had found beside the workstation, written in handwriting too precise and too technically specific to belong to someone unfamiliar with formal engineering documentation. The notation described the exact failure mechanism, the specific component replaced, and the reasoning behind the diagnosis in language that Evelyn recognized immediately as the vocabulary of someone trained at the highest levels of the field, not the vocabulary of someone improvising out of luck. She asked Jackson to find Gabriel Hayes immediately and bring him to her office, though she was careful, even then, not to explain why. Gabriel was found in the employee parking lot, sitting in his car with the engine running for warmth, looking slowly through photographs of Grace on his phone before driving home to sleep. He followed Jackson back into the building without protest, assuming he was about to be reprimanded for entering a restricted area without proper authorization, and prepared the quiet, unremarkable apology he had used 100 times before to avoid unnecessary conflict. When he entered Evelyn's office, she did not look angry the way he had expected. She looked, instead, like a woman trying to solve a second puzzle that had appeared the very moment the first one finally disappeared. She asked him directly whether he had been the one to repair the prototype, and Gabriel, who had never been comfortable lying about anything that truly mattered, admitted simply that he had. He explained the failure carefully and precisely, describing the thermal relay, the signal delay, and the reasoning that had led him to the diagnosis, using language that made it immediately clear he was not guessing or stumbling onto an answer by accident. Evelyn listened without interrupting once, her expression shifting slowly from professional curiosity into something closer to genuine disbelief, and when he finished speaking she asked the only question that mattered to her in that moment, which was where exactly a maintenance worker had learned to think in precisely that way. Gabriel hesitated for the first time since entering the room, weighing 8 years of careful silence against the simple fact that lying any further would accomplish nothing useful for either of them. He told her, briefly and without embellishment, about the aerospace firm, about the propulsion systems he had once helped design, about Hannah, and about the choice he had made when Grace was 6 months old and he was the only parent she had left in the world. He explained that he had taken the job at Aurora Dynamics specifically because the night shift allowed him to be present for his daughter during the day, and that he had never intended for anyone to know more than that simple fact. Evelyn sat in silence for a long moment after he finished speaking, the kind of silence that comes when someone realizes they have been looking directly at something remarkable without ever truly seeing it at all. After Gabriel left her office that morning, Evelyn found herself searching his name alongside the aerospace firm he had mentioned, half expecting to find nothing more than a junior title buried in some forgotten archive. Instead, she found 3 patents filed under his name from nearly a decade earlier, each one tied to propulsion control systems still referenced in technical papers she herself had read during her own years of training. She found a brief industry profile describing him as one of the most promising young engineers in his division, and a short, almost incidental mention of his abrupt departure following what the article vaguely described as a personal loss. She closed the browser window slowly, aware that she had just learned more about the man in 10 minutes of searching than she had learned about most of her own senior staff in years of working alongside them. Word of what had happened spread through the engineering department by mid-morning, though not through any formal announcement Evelyn made. Jackson Reed told 2 colleagues in confidence, who told several more without quite meaning to, and by lunchtime nearly everyone in the building knew that the maintenance worker they had laughed at the night before had solved a problem that defeated the entire senior engineering staff in a single quiet hour. The reaction was not universally gracious. Some engineers felt embarrassed by how easily they had dismissed him. A few felt genuinely impressed despite themselves, and at least one muttered under his breath that it must have been luck, since luck was always easier to accept than the alternative explanation sitting in front of them. Jackson Reed, to his credit, did none of that. He found Gabriel near the break room later that afternoon and apologized directly, without excuses or qualifications, acknowledging plainly that he had judged a man by his uniform instead of by his mind, and that the mistake belonged entirely to him. Gabriel accepted the apology with the same quiet ease he brought to everything else, telling Jackson that he had been judged by uniforms before and understood exactly how easy the mistake was to make under pressure. The 2 men stood together for a moment longer than the conversation strictly required, an unspoken understanding passing between them that had nothing to do with engines and everything to do with the kind of respect that only forms after one person has been genuinely humbled. Jackson admitted, almost reluctantly, that he had spent his entire career believing that talent always announced itself, that the smartest people in any room eventually made themselves known through titles, degrees, and the particular confidence that came with both. Gabriel told him gently that he had once believed the same thing himself, back when he still wore a different kind of uniform and carried a different kind of confidence, and that grief had taught him how quickly the things a person built their identity around could be stripped away without warning. Jackson did not fully understand the remark in that moment, but he carried it with him for the rest of the week, turning it over the way a person turns over a stone that feels heavier than its size suggests. Evelyn called Gabriel back into her office later that same afternoon, this time with a proposal rather than a question waiting for him. She explained that she intended to announce his contribution publicly, perhaps even feature him in the investor presentation as proof that Aurora Dynamics valued talent wherever it appeared, regardless of title or uniform, or how a person arrived at the company in the first place. She watched his face carefully as she spoke, expecting gratitude or perhaps quiet excitement, and was surprised instead by the gentle, almost apologetic way he asked her not to do that. He explained, simply and without drama, that he had spent 8 years building a life that allowed him to be fully present for his daughter, and that the last thing he wanted was a spotlight that might disrupt the only kind of stability he had left to offer her. Evelyn studied him for a long moment, the way a person studies something they thought they understood and are now seeing clearly for the very first time. She had spent her entire career believing that recognition was the highest reward anyone could offer, the thing every person secretly wanted no matter how modestly they framed their own ambitions. Gabriel's quiet request forced her to consider, for the first time in longer than she could remember, that some people measured success by something other than visibility, something closer to peace. She finally nodded, and instead of a public announcement, she offered him something quieter, a position as a technical advisor with flexible hours that would allow him to keep his evenings free for Grace, while still using the expertise he had carefully hidden for nearly a decade. Gabriel accepted the offer the following week, though he insisted on keeping his old uniform in his locker. A small private joke he never fully explained to anyone, including himself. He began spending his mornings in quiet consultation with the engineering team, reviewing designs and catching errors with the kind of instinct that came from decades of real experience rather than formal review meetings. He still picked Grace up from school most afternoons, still called her every evening before bed regardless of how his day had gone, and still refused every offer of a larger office or a more visible title that might have come with his new responsibilities. Jackson Reed, once his harshest critic, became one of his most attentive students, often staying late simply to ask Gabriel questions about problems that had nothing to do with the day's actual assigned work. The investor demonstration took place the following afternoon exactly as scheduled, the Helix prototype performing flawlessly in front of a room that had no idea how close the entire project had come to collapsing less than 15 hours earlier. That morning, before the doors opened to investors, Evelyn had walked through the garage one final time, watching the prototype undergo a last round of routine checks performed by engineers who still spoke about the previous night in hushed, almost disbelieving tones. Jackson Reed stood near the vehicle running a final diagnostic sweep, glancing occasionally toward the small office where Gabriel sat quietly reviewing unrelated paperwork, as though some part of him needed the reassurance of knowing the man who had saved everything was still nearby. Evelyn had considered briefly asking Gabriel to be present in the room during the presentation itself, simply as an extra precaution should anything unexpected arise, but she respected his wishes enough not to ask twice after he had already told her once that he preferred to remain in the background. The federal transportation official asked sharp, detailed questions about the vehicle's reliability under extreme conditions, and Evelyn answered each one with a calm confidence that surprised even her own board members, who had spent the previous night fielding anxious phone calls. By the end of the presentation, the funding Aurora Dynamics needed for the next 3 years had been secured, and the small crisis that had nearly derailed everything was already being spoken of in the past tense, as though it had never truly threatened the company at all. Evelyn found herself, in the weeks that followed, lingering near Gabriel's small office more often than business strictly required of her. She told herself it was professional curiosity, a simple desire to understand how a man with his background had remained so completely unknown to the company for so long. But the explanation grew thinner each time she offered it to herself in private. One evening, working later than usual, she overheard him on the phone with Grace through his half-open door, his voice softening into a register she had never once heard him use in any meeting, patient and warm and entirely without the careful professional neutrality he wore during business hours. She did not interrupt him. She simply stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to a kind of devotion she had rarely encountered in anyone she had worked with, before quietly continuing on her way down the corridor. Their conversations grew longer over the following months, drifting slowly from engineering problems into smaller, more personal territory, the way two careful people sometimes circle closer to each other without either one naming what is actually happening between them. Evelyn never offered him the spotlight again, having learned that some forms of respect required restraint rather than recognition, and Gabriel never asked for anything beyond the quiet stability he had built so carefully for his daughter. What grew between them instead was something neither had expected and neither rushed, built on the kind of mutual regard that comes only after one person has truly seen another at their most unguarded and chosen to honor it rather than expose it. Occasionally they shared coffee in the small kitchen near the engineering floor, conversations that began with budgets or schedules and somehow always drifted toward smaller things, a song Gabriel remembered Hannah humming while she worked, a board meeting Evelyn had once nearly walked out of in frustration. Neither of them rushed toward anything resembling a declaration, content instead to let the friendship settle into its own steady rhythm, the way two people sometimes build trust more durably in silence than in any grand gesture. It was for both of them an entirely unfamiliar kind of patience, and neither seemed eager to disturb it by naming it too soon. Aurora Dynamics moved forward into its next generation of vehicles with renewed confidence from its board and its investors. The crisis of that one long night into company history is little more than a cautionary footnote. But inside its walls, a much smaller and quieter story continued to unfold, one that had begun the night. 100 engineers admitted defeat, and a single father, unnoticed by everyone in the room, simply opened the hood and found what all of them had missed. On a quiet evening nearly a year later, Evelyn stayed behind after most of the building had emptied out, ostensibly to review a budget proposal that could easily have waited until morning. She found Gabriel in his small office exactly where she expected him, sleeves rolled up, comparing two versions of a schematic with the same patient focus he brought to everything he touched. She asked, almost without meaning to, whether he ever missed the life he had given up, the patents, the recognition, the career that might have carried him somewhere far more visible than a quiet office on the third floor. Gabriel considered the question seriously before answering, the way he considered most things, and told her that he had built engines that flew faster than sound, but none of them had ever once called him on the phone to tell him about a horse with too many legs. Evelyn smiled at that, more openly than she usually allowed herself at work, and understood, perhaps for the first time, that some achievements were never meant to be measured by how far they traveled, but by how faithfully they stayed. Gabriel Hayes never asked to be remembered as anything other than what he already was, a man who had once flown faster than sound and chosen, without regret, to spend his life moving slower for the sake of someone he loved more than any career he had ever held.